Hi, so welcome back to the third of our 15-minute webinars and Happy New Year. We're into 2023. Yeah. So just before Christmas, we did part one of our water webinar. And because there was so much to fit into that, we decided to split water into two separate webinars. So today is part two of water.
So just to recap on that first webinar, we had a look at what happens to a raindrop in terms of joining the sea, so tracing its path downstream to the sea. We looked at how to calculate a drainage basin, and then we had a sneak peek at our new UK Rivers Atlas that was launched as part of Teach with GIS. And since then, we've updated the Teach with GIS page, and we now have a global Rivers Atlas as well. So should we just have a quick look at that Global Rivers Atlas?
Absolutely, let's take a peek at that. So the Global Rivers Atlas works in pretty much the same way as the UK Rivers Atlas, except you've got the major global drainage basins. So you could choose a river anywhere in the world and see how the catchment area of that river covers, the size of the river, its discharge, and compare those rivers globally rather than just the rivers of the UK.
Fantastic. Okay, so what else are we going to look at in today's water webinar?
So today we're going to look at taking that a little bit further and building up a case study of the rivers that you might be teaching about. So adding a little bit more detail to those case studies, looking at your catchment characteristics and the sort of drainage basin hydrology a little bit further as well.
Fantastic. So I think we're going to make a start with the River Tees because we have a lot of ready-made resources. We know it's a really popular case study, and so this is an example of the art of the possible, and if you happen to have the River Tees as your case study, it's hopefully a resource that you can immediately start exploring with your students. So let's dive into the River Tees.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump into a collection of story maps about the River Tees. That's all this is. It's just a collection of story maps that bring together some GIS tools to explore this particular river. In this first one of these story maps, it's that GIS visualizer concept that we talked about in our very first 15-minute webinar. It's just a way for your students to virtually explore the catchment and the course of the river itself. So we've got sort of a satellite image, we've got the River Tees catchment marked out. You can look at things like the related streams and tributaries. Because we've got the 3D capabilities, we can flip that so that we can look at it from mouth to source, and we can bring in data layers like geology, for example. So this is really a resource that we're sort of envisaging your students can get hands-on with and explore for themselves, and that you can set relevant questions around. And as we move on through, we've got more detailed sort of exploration of different aspects of the course, bringing in photo resources. So it's got to be High Force that we go and have a look at, right? So here's High Force Waterfall. And if we just click on that pin, it will load up some photo resources for us. So students can explore both the GIS and also some of these photo resources to sort of answer questions around the waterfall itself. And we can move down through the middle course into the lower course and looking at things like flooding risk at the river's mouth. I like the way that bounces in and out there. And then moving on through this collection of story maps, we've got other aspects of case study information. So we can look at things like the human impacts. So one that I quite like here is, it's very topical at the moment, all this information about sewage that's being input into rivers. And then in part 3, we can get more into a sort of digital fieldwork approach. So not just kind of looking at pre-prepared layers, but actually bringing to bear things like the elevation profile tool so that students are taking their own measurements, albeit in virtual reality, but their own measurements of that river along different aspects of its course. So hopefully that's pretty much a ready-made, ready-to-go resource that you can bring into your classroom straight away about a river that we know is very popular. But if you're not looking at the River Tees, if you want to start to build this kind of material for yourself, some of the information is in part 1, where you can do things like trace the course of the river downstream and build the drainage basin. But we want to give you a little bit more detail as to how you can bring those kind of case studies together for yourself. So Dave, do you want to take over driving and talk us through your your river case study?
Yeah, so I've built a map already, so I'm going to take us over to the map that I've made. And if you've watched the first part of our water webinar, you might recognise this drainage basin, because it's the drainage basin that we drew up in the Lake District that was draining from that raindrop that we placed in the landscape. So all I've done is I've just added it into a new map in the map viewer, and I've just kind of changed the symbol so I can see where the outline of that drainage basin falls. So now I can start to do exactly the same sorts of things as I was in that.
I just want to jump in there because one of the things that I'm interested in as we're building this kind of case study is I'm just thinking about those NEA students and kind of visualizations that they can put into their NEA maps essentially. And this is really simple cartography, just a nice clean white line on a satellite image. But I really like the way it looks. I think it really kind of crisply immediately identifies an area of interest.
Yeah, and if I zoom out a little bit, actually that's really quite useful for sort of contextualising where is this drainage basin on a national scale. So we can kind of see that it's in the northwest of England, up in the Lake District. But it's maybe not so good if I want to really focus my attention or the attention of my students on this area, not what's outside of this area, particularly when you start to chuck other stuff on there as well.
Because we're often all about the accidental learning where students kind of wander off piste a little bit and go and check out other areas of the map. So what you're going to show us is a way of really focusing student interest only on the area that you want them to look at.
Absolutely. I kind of want to make the edge of this drainage basin the edge of the world for a while. So the way I'm going to do that is to use a blend mode in ArcGIS Online, which sounds kind of fancy, but is
super simple.
Super simple. So with my layer selected, and actually I'm not going to do it on that layer. I'm going to do it on the next one down.
Okay.
Because that's showing me that area kind of coloured in. So rather than just the outline, I'm going to do it on that coloured in version of this layer.
Okay.
So over here on the right hand side, in the properties, which is this top button on the right, I have a little appearance group, and in the appearance group I have this blending option, and I'm going to choose from this list the blend mode called destination in, and that's going to act a bit like a cookie cutter really, and it's going to get rid of all of the map around and just leave me with the area of map within my drainage basin.
Again, I just really like this as a visualization. I can just imagine kind of case study areas that students are identifying this as a way of sort of really highlighting the very specifics of what they're looking at. So, are we going to put some data into this as well?
Yeah, let's. So we can start to explore, kind of perhaps using, again, that geography visualizer concept. I can start to look at the land cover within this catchment. I can maybe get a bit of an idea of sort of the topography as well.
So I'm immediately thinking things like colour, the shapes that we can see here. As you've sort of mentioned, we've got the edges of the outlines of those hills where this raindrop initially fell.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can see sort of field boundaries. I can see maybe I've got kind of quite a lot of agricultural land down to the bottom, perhaps more sort of natural grassland.
Sort of industrial area there.
Yeah, we've got a kind of urban area towards sort of the northwest of my catchment there. But let's explore that land cover with some data instead. So this time I've added in a land cover data set.
Okay, hold up a second. Whose land cover data?
Okay, so this data is from a data set known as Careen, and Careen is a European-wide land cover data set.
Oh wow, so they can do any river in the UK, and if they're looking at European rivers, they can do the same thing there as well.
Absolutely, yeah, the same data set would cover all of that.
Fantastic. And if we sort of go into the layer properties here, we can kind of move between this sort of data layer outline and that original satellite imagery that we're looking at. So we can compare sort of what it looks like in reality with what's recorded in terms of the data.
Absolutely. So I can use either the transparency slider to sort of swoosh one away and kind of transition from the symbology to the data set underneath, or I can use that little visibility button to just toggle one off and on. The other thing, I've got this little arrow on the left because each of the land uses in this data set are sort of separated individually. So if I'm just interested in seeing, well, where is the woodland in this catchment, I can turn off all of the other land covers and just be left with the woodland land cover, which perhaps isn't the best one to have chosen on an aerial image because it's green on green. But
could you change that colour?
I could dig into the symbology on the right and change that colour for something that would perhaps be a bit more contrasty.
Or in terms of that like crisp white outline, you could sort of bring that aspect in to really just highlight areas that you're looking at. Yeah. Always worth having a think about the symbology, and we sort of provide these maps with one type of symbology, but you can always edit to fit your purposes. So the land cover map, I just find fantastic. I really love doing that transparency side of thing, and where you sort of pick out each individual type of land cover and just seeing how nicely they map to the satellite imagery, actually, that there is this real correlation between what you see and that recorded technical data about what's actually there. But it's really nice if we can kind of dig below that surface layer, because the satellite imagery can give us a lot of a clue as to land cover, but where it's more tricky is stuff like geology. So, geology layers?
Absolutely, yeah. So if I just turn off the land cover and this next layer down, I've got a geology data set. And it's a geology data set that's published by the British Geological Survey. So again, it's an authoritative kind of top quality data set.
And what happens when we click on that? Is it going to give us some more information about what these different colours are representing?
It absolutely is, because even if I look at the legend for this one, the legend for a geology map, unless you're a geologist, is probably a bit impenetrable. But if I click on an area that I'm interested in, I can see right at the top here that this is this red area is a band of sedimentary rock, sandstones and sort of conglomerates. So I can start to get an idea of maybe the permeability of that rock and how it might be contributing to the hydrology of that drainage basin.
Which leads us really neatly into things like risks of flooding. So we've had a look now at what's happening under the ground, at what's happening on top of the ground, and in terms of what that's translating into actual flooding activity, we've got a data layer for that as well.
We do. So the Environment Agency publish their risk map into the Living Atlas. So it's there in ArcGIS Online for us to add to our maps. And it works best if you kind of zoom in a little bit. So if I'm trying to look at this at a whole catchment scale, it's quite a complex data set. It's quite kind of detailed. So it's better to use at slightly more kind of local scales. But here where I've got, I've kind of zoomed into that urban area within my catchment, I can start to see the impact that flooding might have within that urban area.
Fantastic. And again, just sort of using the transparency tool there to kind of give us the ability to see where there's flood risk and sort of what's currently happening in that particular area of the landscape. So quite a few houses here. They're in low risk areas. Some over here that are more kind of in a high risk area of flooding from that river though. So just a really nice way for students to really quickly connect with both the sort of river processes that are taking place in that area and their impacts on human settlement.
Absolutely, yeah. And I could kind of really see that if you were struggling and you kind of like you couldn't quite manage to get get your students hands-on with this data in the GIS, that you could use this almost kind of cookie-cuttered view and capture a series of screenshots of these and kind of build yourself a little collection of sort of catchment outlines with different characteristics sort of mapped inside.
I absolutely love this as a kind of little lesson idea, because I can really see you kind of giving this little cookie cutter landscape here, and then particularly with sort of your older students, what are their predictions in terms of flooding risk in this area, and the basis for that given the data that you've given them. So it's kind of exam practice, or maybe sort of more decision making kind of exercise practice, so that they're not just sort of passively receiving. You can really sort of dig into their depth of knowledge and test them a little bit in terms of how well they can apply that to other areas. Also, I just think the visualizations look really nice. I almost want these as kind of like a little set of artwork for my wall.